In this next session, GCCA Executive Director Andrew Spiegel catches up with Julien Wiggins, CEO of Bowel Cancer Australia. With support from employees, volunteers, and donors, Julien has initiated an ambitious strategy for the charity to have an everlasting impact where no Australian dies from bowel cancer and those diagnosed receive the support they need. Under his leadership, the 100% community-funded charity realized its long-term goal of funding the Lawrence Penn Chair of Bowel Cancer Research at the University of Sydney. Today, Julien and Andrew will discuss some of the biosimilar policies affecting patients in Australia. In 2015, Australia broke with the practices of other advanced nations and became the first to permit the automatic substitution of a biosimilar in place of the physician-chosen biologic. Australian physicians at the time vehemently opposed this policy, led by the Australian Rheumatology Association. Survey data showed that physicians felt 2-to-1 that the decision over whether patients can be forcibly switched should be a medical decision made by their health regulator, the TGA, not a purely economic decision made by the payer. They wanted more data and more robust pharmacovigilance. The physicians pushed back, advising their members to prevent substitutions whenever possible when prescribing. Biosimilar uptake remained low, and some manufacturers pulled their products out. Fast forward to 2021, where we will learn now even stage 4 cancer patients are being forcibly switched, and the patient advocate community is not happy about it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next segment of our Biosimilars training program. I'm really excited for this segment because we're going to hear from another perspective, and this time from Australia. I'm really pleased that Julien Wiggins, the CEO of Bowel Cancer Australia, is joining us to talk about his perspective of the biosimilar landscape down under in Australia. And by the way, Julien has quite a story to tell about how he got involved with Bowel Cancer Australia and how Bowel Cancer Australia has really moved the needle for bowel cancer or colorectal cancer in Australia. And if you would like to hear more of Julien's story and the story of Bowel Cancer Australia, I would suggest you go back to our conference presentation that we did a couple of months ago. And Julien did a heck of a presentation on the bowel cancer situation in Australia and the great work that Bowel Cancer Australia has done. You can access all of our recordings at gccacongress.org. You can go back and review all of the great presentations from the Congress, including Julien. So Julien, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's late at night in Australia. It's early here in the US. So thank you for fitting us into your life, and want to talk to you just for a few minutes about your impressions of the biosimilars experience in Australia.
Well, thanks for having me, more importantly, Andy. And I think you probably oversold my previous presentation, so I hope it hasn't set too high an expectation for this one. But first of all, yes, Bowel Cancer Australia, the organisation's been around for around about 20 years. We really came into our own 2005 onwards, because really that was when Avastin, the first biologic, was really entering the Australian market. Before I begin, just wanted to clarify too that I guess Bowel Cancer Australia's financial independence really underpins our ability to speak freely and really champion what matters most to people affected by bowel cancer. So in the disclosure up front would be that we receive less than 1% of our income is actually derived from pharma. And for full disclosure, less than 2% currently was received from government. And that was only through COVID assistance. Typically, we're 100% community funded. We receive no funding from government whatsoever. And just to give a brief overview, as I said, way back when in 2004, Avastin was first listed by the FDA. This table, again, can be found on our website. It just really provides an overview of the trials and tribulations and everything in between that we've had to go through, really to have a lot of biologics listed through our HTA system, which involves the PBAC, Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, which then lists it publicly funded on the PBS, which is the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. So as you can see, unfortunately, there's a lot of red in this diagram. They are rejections from the Pharmaceutical Benefits Committee as to the biologics initially coming in. And as you work your way down the list and further to the right, you can see the rapid introduction of biologics. And the only note I would make here is one of the biologics to be introduced for patients actually took 6 years and 8 submissions to actually get listed as publicly funded. So there's an indication of how long it has taken over the years to actually get some of these drugs and biologics listed. More importantly, as you can see, the days have shrunk as the years have moved on. Unfortunately, there's a 20-year span there to make that happen. But the most recent, of course, being Mavasi, which only took 336 days, which was slightly more than Braftovi. So when it comes to Mavasi, we only have one biosimilar for bowel cancer or colorectal cancer, metastatic colorectal cancer in Australia at this point in time. And as you can see on the left there, we actually have a number of biologics that are still available. They're not necessarily names that are known, I would say, to patients either. A lot of the decisions to actually use these drugs or treatments are actually made at a public hospital level by doctors, hospital administrators, for the benefit of doctors and patients within the system. That said and done, I won't go into too much more detail. It can be found on our website. And of course, the very top one is Avastin, which is pretty much my topic of discussion today because it's our most recent experience with the introduction of the first biosimilar for metastatic colorectal cancer or metastatic bowel cancer.
So I think you were going to talk to us about how best to get biosimilar uptake in Australia.
I think we don't have a choice when it comes to metastatic bowel cancer at this point because that is our only option. Back in 2017, we have a government policy which was we encourage prescribing of biosimilars really over a biologic for naive patients, the treatment of naive patients. The biosimilars got a faster approval process in prescribing them compared to a higher authority still required for a biologic. And while it's not yet compulsory for the treatment of naive patients to prescribe a biosimilar, it is government policy. So I'm not sure how that really works out, but that's the current scenario when it comes to Australia. So the introduction, of course, of biosimilars, like everywhere else in the world, designed to encourage competition in the market, lower the prices, provide better access to affordable medicines, and ideally greater options for patients at the end of the day. Now, the interesting thing is when a biosimilar or another brand is added, the second brand of the medicine, there's an instant across all brands 25% statutory price reduction for the current incumbent drug, as you would. And that's the rebate the government actually pays. So that's when it comes to pricing. It's quite a fundamental cut, but nonetheless, it's telegraphed early. Companies know about it. And so again, if you're in the company, I could actually budget that in when the time comes. If the patent comes off my product, then I know this is what potentially I'm up for once the second brand comes onto the PBS. And so just our first biosimilar for metastatic bowel cancer was Zirabev, recommended in July 2020. It received a positive recommendation. And again, this is coming back to what I said earlier, the system really becomes really fixated on the cost to government. I would argue that really it's about extending and improving quality of a patient's life, and cost potentially secondary, but nonetheless, that's not necessarily how our system operates. Everything is phrased in net cost to government, and yet everyone still pays their taxes. So again, they're not expecting the market to grow with the introduction of that biosimilar. It wasn't going to cost government any more. It was ideally going to sit alongside Avastin as the first biosimilar. Avastin would have taken a 25% price cut. But as of today, when I last checked, that actual application is inactive. The company at this point has not advised whether or not they intend to proceed with the listing on the PBS, even though they have a positive recommendation. So that's because once you get a positive recommendation in Australia, you then have to sit down with the Department of Health and start netting out a price for a biologic, equally biosimilar. And I'll get to that with my next example. So the second biosimilar in Australia, which was listed last year, 1st of June, is Mavasi. It was recommended, as you can see, in November 2020. And again, it had no net cost to the government, and it wasn't expected to grow the market in terms of there was no more patients expected to be able to access the drug than what it was indicated for. And I really don't like the terminology around that, but I've just taken that straight from the PBAC. Then in March last year, the company sought to change the restrictions and the wording around non-small cell lung cancer to align it with their TGA approval. So basically, what happened is the The company sought to change their restriction for the use of Mavacin, as well as, of course, it would have been for Avastin at the time, and of course, it would have been for Zirabev as well, because they were all indicated for metastatic colorectal cancer. But because they were changing the restricting of the wording for non-small cell lung cancer to align with their approval with the initial registration in the country with the TGA, they actually proposed an undisclosed price reduction in addition to the 25% statutory price cut that would apply to everybody once a second treatment is listed onto the PBS.
So the biosimilar manufacturer was coming in at a lower price than even the 25%. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. They came in at an even lower price than the statutory required price at 25%. So as things then transpired, the PBAC changed the indication now to unrestricted for a lot more patients, a different patient pool as well. So you then had potential 10 to 20% increase in what the PBA thought of utilization of Avastin, Mavacin, Zirabev potentially. So to offset that, they've then decided that they will cap the amount and how many repeats will be appropriate for an unrestricted access to this treatment. And as you can see, that was capped at about 1,800 milligrams, or if not about, it was at 1,800 milligrams. And to be cost effective, PBAC requested a further 10 to 20% price reduction in addition to the 25% statutory price reduction. So we're starting to get into territory now where potentially if I was a company, and I'm just wearing that sort of corporate hat, as it were, trying to work out, well, if I have a current treatment that is available, I know that as soon as there is a second treatment listed, I'll have an automatic price reduction of 25%. I've already had my treatment listed and agreed to an undisclosed price with the department anyhow to have it listed in the first place. Now, then I'm potentially going to be faced with a further price reduction than what was initially telegraphed.
Meaning that the biosimilar company was coming in at such a discount that the originator product was going to have to face competition where the price dropped more than 25%. Is that right?
Correct. More than 25% it would have dropped. And more importantly, one thing is it was capped by the PBAC for usage at 1,800 milligrams. And so my next slide demonstrates the complete price difference we're now talking about. So at one level, yes, the competitor comes in with a lower price. The PBAC were after a lower price as well, but then they've capped the maximum usage as well. So prior to 1 June 2021, you would have got, say, 900 milligrams of Avastin monotherapy for around about $2,900.15. From 1 June, however, 2021, you can see there, and that's now 1,800 milligrams of Mavacin monotherapy for $2,300 odd, which basically, if you look at it on a per milligram basis, is 60% lower. So no more as the 25% apply, it's gone beyond that. So more patients with different disease states have access to it. And as a consequence, however, those with metastatic bowel cancer who are already receiving treatment with Avastin were now faced with the conundrum, because what come from the 60% potentially lower price was the fact is Roche then notified that they will be withdrawing Avastin from the PBS. And in less than 4 weeks later, they removed one dose from the Australian market altogether. And by the end of last year, they'd removed the other dose completely. So we no longer have Avastin, the biologic, in the Australian market, period.
So what you're saying is that because the biosimilar company was able to price the drug at such a low rate that the original drug has left the market?
I think a combination of not only the competitor coming in with the discounted rate on top of the 25% discount, but then the PBAC putting a ceiling, I would say, on the amount of milligrams available in a monotherapy for usage at a maximum, and then only allocating a maximum of 7 repeats. So I think the combination of how all this is entangled behind closed doors, may I add, we're not privy to any discussions as to how they transpire. We're not privy to price. All this is done in secret and on the quiet, negotiated commercial in confidence and the like. We're only really notified of the outcome. And we were notified of the outcome, which was Avastin was coming off the PBS from 1 June 2021, very late April this time last year. And then once we got our facts together, sort of thing, we actually were the organisation that had to inform patients effectively because no one else had. So with less than a month to go, patients were being told, those on Avastin, that from 1 June, that Avastin would no longer be available for them. And so that raises another whole series of questions as to the potential impact, positive or negative. But at this point, we weren't seeing too many positives in it because there was a state of confusion. The department hadn't communicated to us. The biosimilar company hadn't communicated to us. The biologic company had, because it at least realised that there are a number of patients who were on Avastin who required knowledge of this. But they had indicated to the TGA, I believe, and they'd also indicated to the department at the time, and they'd made a public statement.
Did this affect everyone in Australia that was taking Avastin?
Correct. Mm-hmm. Everybody. And at that point, I guess it was predominantly, I would say, breast and metastatic colorectal cancer. Majority. There was some other sort of indications for Avastin. And just as an indication here, for example, in the sort of calendar year, March 20 to 21, there were about 30,000 scripts written for Avastin for the treatment of metastatic bowel cancer. So we're not talking a small quantity. So yeah, so there's still a lot of patients, a lot of unnecessary, I think the handling of it was terrible. Could have been a lot better. It wasn't. The biosimilar company only engaged after the media sort of started running with it as well. Which was, to our disappointment in that respect, but nonetheless, they still remain fairly quiet. We did actually ask if those receiving Avastin could actually be grandfathered so that they could continue to receive Avastin at a subsidised rate, and the answer was no. So we're also concerned then, how are patients informed when they're going in for the IV? Who's actually telling them? Or are they being told? And we have a naming situation in Australia whereby we don't differentiate. So we always use a brand name as a charity because it is easy to talk about the different brands. But when you're actually going in to receive your chemotherapy, you'll only ever know it as Bevacizumab, no matter what the brand. And so therefore, where's the forced switching effectively from Avastin to Mevacin occurred during the month of June last year and onwards, if you're already receiving Avastin as the biologic in your treatment regime. So yeah, so taking that on, and biosimilars were meant to create competition and increase it, lower prices. Well, it certainly lowered the price. I think it pretty much floored the price to a degree, because there's 2 other biosimilars that actually still haven't decided to list on the PBS because they're now inactive. We don't know how far that price is being lowered, and is it also detrimental to the listing of new biosimilars for metastatic colorectal cancer or bowel cancer patients. Likewise, so we have switched a biologic, which was the only option effectively for Bevacizumab at the time, with the biosimilar. So we've replaced one with another monopoly effectively, if you want to look at it that way. It just happens that the biosimilar is also owned by the same company who has a biologic in the first and second line treatment for metastatic colorectal cancer as well. But that to me doesn't really speak of competition. And then, as I said, will the deeper the normal price cut apply to all new biosimilars coming in for Avastin? Or will they decide not to list, and actually the net sum game is actually patients are no real better off because there still is only one option at this point for the equivalent of Avastin in that respect. Time will tell, I get that. Still 12 months in. Handled poorly would be a polite way of saying it in that respect, but we're still here championing what matters most to patients affected by the disease. And if we look at other sort of biosimilars on the horizon, Bevmi 2021 in November received a positive listing again. Again, it had no net cost now to government because the same indicated now for the same as Mevacin. But as of today, it's considered inactive because they've not still responded to the department within 60 days of receiving that positive recommendation. So that takes us to Bevacizumab. And in March 2022, which is just last month, it received a positive recommendation to be listed again, similar conditions as Mevacin. Again, it's going to have no net cost to government, and it's not expected to expand the market, which Mevacin already has. We don't know at this point because the minutes have only just been released as to whether or not the company will actually advise that they intend to actually be now listed on the PBS. So that pretty much is a state of play, is how I would say in Australia, 12 months in, specifically related to bowel cancer patients or metastatic colorectal cancer patients. I find these two comments probably the most telling when it comes to the PBAC and what it really, what we can expect, I think, in this country, and how patients almost, to a degree, really a secondary, I would argue, in the whole equation, if not third. And I'd say probably that is utilisation, savings to government, then of course industry, and then maybe patients are the third afterthought after that, as opposed to patients first, all the time, every time. So in responding to the question at a pharma conference last year, which was asked of the PBAC chair about this very issue, basically said that there was a biosimilar coming through, and normally the innovative drug or the originator, which in this case would have been Avastin, sits alongside the biosimilar. And that's what we've always been told. The biosimilar comes in to sit alongside so patients have choice. That's what it's about. Patients can decide with their clinicians and choose the best treatment that is right for them at that point in time, given their patient preferences and given their circumstances. And we take that one step further. Even if the treatment is not listed on the PBS, a treatment option, if it is available in this country, should still be on the table for discussion. And it's a decision between the patient and their specialist in deriving and working out which one ultimately that they will choose for their treatment option. But if we then look at the actual public summary document from the minutes of the meeting and likewise the MAVASI document, the PBAC acknowledged straight up it's common for the originator, which in this case would have been Avastin, to cease supply, or Roche, I should say, to cease supply or divest their brand once the reduction mechanisms apply. So our question is really, well, what is it? Which one? Are they sitting alongside each other? Or really, are you going to introduce one to have others that potentially have floored the price so low that maybe none others enter the market? Or we ideally have one alongside. So that's why I asked, I guess, your audience this question, and that's what I'll probably end on. Is it an unintended consequence of policy, or is it really by design?
Yeah, that really is the question, isn't it? And we may never know the answer to that, but we do know that that second statement that they don't sit side by side, that the originator generally stops manufacturing when a biosimilar, that is not the experience that we've seen around the world. We don't see that in the US, Canada, the EU, South America. I can't think of another country where we see them not sitting side by side, and we see that the originator ceases supply or stops the brand. So if this is unique to Australia, it obviously shows us that there's a policy problem. What advice might you give the patient community in Australia on how to combat this policy?
I think the real fundamental for me is, where is the patient in all this? Mm-hmm. And what we are effectively doing is potentially pitting other patient populations against the others. It shouldn't be that way at the end of the day. Right. If you're going to increase the utilization or allow the indication to increase, then there will be a cost to government, because that is going to have more people having access and be able to use it. Admit the fact and stop artificially capping the amount that can be used to try and contain costs. We have a HTA review underway shortly. We've got a national medicines policy review, but a lot of this is all hot air and talk. At the end of the day, if you read the fine print very clearly, the parameters are being set and are very finite and very tight. And I think there's a lot of people getting really caught up in the hope that something may happen. In reality, it's structured in such a way that the outcome, I think, is already a foregone conclusion. So I'm really an optimistic person, believe me, and I'm really a happy person as well. But when it comes to this, it is really patients almost, the system is not working for them. Yeah. At the end of the day. And I think fighting the system when the system is really, another example of this, I don't want to see this ever repeated again. We're not delivering treatments for patients and giving them the choice that was promised, as well as the cost savings for government, which are there as well. It can be a win-win, but I'm not seeing it yet.
Right, and that's why it was so important that we get this story down, because we want to get every story, and they're not all like this. There's many biosimilar success stories, and this is not one of them. So when we think about something that you just said, which is that where is the patient, that where is the physician and the patient in this whole conversation about which choice a patient should, which drug a patient should take. And this has been one of the key topics of this whole 2 days that we've spent talking about this, is that we know from data and from experience that the key to biosimilar uptake is engaging the patients early on and engaging the physicians and getting the confidence from them to know that these are safe and effective products, not just, as you say, shove them down the patient's throat without any input from the patient or any input from the physician.
We do have the ability, even though it's not compulsory, but it is government policy, remember, to actually, you can tick a box. So the biosimilar is not prescribed if you're the prescriber, but in ticking the box, you also have to nominate the brand you want to receive, because if you don't, then the pharmacy can still substitute or switch out the brand on the original as well as any repeats. So it's important that that is an option for patients to sit down with their specialist, but of course, it only applies when you have a choice. And when you've got more than one, which isn't a choice, because that's all you have. So it works in theory, but that's assuming, as I said, in the perfect world, and as you said, the experiences of others, if the biologic is sitting right next to the multiple biosimilars, you have a lot of choice. But that's not what we have at the moment. The real issue comes down to the PBAC, which is an expert independent panel, we're continually told by the government, which it no doubt is, but it also is doing a lot of the bidding of government. So government doesn't have to make these hard decisions. I would channel my focus there at this point because the HTA review is coming, but again, I'm not holding out too much hope, but that to me is really fundamental in our system.
What can the rest of the world learn from this Australian experience? Maybe what not to do? I don't know. What can the rest of the world learn?
I always think you can always learn by not repeating.
Yeah.
And we haven't done it perfectly by any stretch. I think the PBAC may even recognize that it was a quote unquote messy rollout, but it's like nothing's changed in that respect. They are, as I said, they may have lowered the floor so far down for pricing that it's discouraging others from entering, and then we've lost the biologics. So where do we go? All I can say is it's not what we were promised, which was biologic, multiple biosimilars, choice, lower prices all round, and more importantly, patients receiving the right treatment at the right time in consultation with their clinician.
And more patients getting access because of the introduction of biosimilars and a transparent system that shows you that. Well, you've got your work cut out for you, Julien, and we all thank you for what you're doing in protecting patients. A stable stage 4 cancer patient should never have their drug taken away from them with no notice whatsoever. And this is a terrible situation, and I've never heard of it anywhere else in the world. So I hope that we can work together and make things change down there, because patients have to get access to these medicines, and there has to be savings, and the promise of biosimilars has to happen for them to be successful. So we wish you a lot of luck. We thank you for sharing the story with us, and best of luck in all of your journeys down in Australia. Thank you so much, Julien.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it. And I hope your audience got something out of our experience.
Thank you, Julien, for your perspective. Ensuring and maintaining patient and physician confidence in biosimilars is critical for any government that wants to enjoy the savings they bring. One of the reasons biosimilars can lower health costs is because of their abbreviated approval process, which is faster and less expensive than for the originator drug. This makes getting accurate, real-world data about switching, safety, and the efficacy of biosimilars all the more important to building or rebuilding that confidence. Thank you.